And we continue the Newsmaker now with Alfred University history professor, Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here, Brian.
Dr. Ostrower, if I could start out asking a question about President Trump wants to pull the U.S. out of a 1992 treaty signed by George H.W. Bush called the Open Skies Treaty. What is the Open Skies Treaty all about? What does it do, and why does Trump want out of it?
It allows countries, the United States, Russia, other countries, to observe from satellites from the air activity in any other country. And the reason why it was passed, actually, it goes back to something that was originally proposed by President Eisenhower back during the early years of the Cold War, actually in the early 1950s. It was called at that time the same thing, the Open Skies Program. And the idea was that if country A knew that country B was mobilizing its troops, let's say, or planning some kind of military maneuvers, it would have the opportunity to, either protest or defend itself or whatever. In other words, the idea was that the more information we had, the more we would know whether or not there is something to be feared. Without that information, we might fear that the other side, the opposition, the potential enemy, is planning something that might affect, our own national interest, and therefore we would respond, even if that response was not in fact justified. So it was a way of, kind of moderating some of the fears, certainly during the early Cold War, and then again in 1992 as a result of the end of the Cold War, because the Open Skies program from the Eisenhower years had never really been implemented, and that was at least in part because of the degree of tension between the U.S. and the Soviet Union back in that period. What President Trump is trying to do is to, in a sense, roll back really, in a sense, to go to a new, I don't know what you would call it, a kind of Cold War a Cold War platform, but to remove some of the guarantees that countries could in fact cooperate, would indeed cooperate, in light of the end of the Cold War. The Cold War ended in 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell, and there were quite a number of agreements between the United States and then what was the old Soviet Union, what becomes Russia, in light of that. I'm just fearful that it's going to put us back onto more of a military footing, and putting us back onto a military footing when we can least afford it. We have just created, if you will, an additional $6 trillion, that's with a T, $6 trillion to $9 trillion in debt. We can hardly afford to gear up for literally to afford another Cold War. And I might add, Brian, that there is also talk in Washington. This has not been formalized yet in the way that Trump has made a specific recommendation regarding the Open Skies Treaty. But there's certainly talk in Washington about rebuilding our nuclear forces. And if we do that, if we essentially eliminate the agreements that we have had with Russia over the production of nuclear weapons, we're going to have another arms race. And that arms race is going to be extremely expensive. And that arms race, again, as I said a moment ago, can hardly be afforded at a time when we have taken on so much more national debt.
Dr. Ostrower, there's another treaty out there that President Trump does not like, the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty of 1951. Now, I'm sure you know that off the top of your head. What I got about it, I did a Google search on. From the Council of Foreign Relations website, it says the Japanese Prime Minister established 3 non-nuclear principles: no possession, no production, or introduction to nuclear arms for Japan. Since that period, Japan has relied on the U.S. nuclear umbrella to deter potential aggressors. What else is there in that 1951 treaty with Japan that was signed apparently in San Francisco, Gary?
Well, it essentially allowed, two things. It allowed for the the end of the American occupation of Japan. We occupied Japan, that is, our American troops occupied Japan from August 1945, after the war ended on August 14th of that year, until 1951. So this allowed for the removal of American troops. Now, when I say a removal of American troops, I mean in terms of as an occupation force. But the same token, it allowed the Japanese to institute a constitution, which is really a very democratic with a small d, a democratic constitution, and it was that constitution which prohibited the Japanese from building their own nuclear arsenal. So I think it had a very, very important effect in respect to stabilizing the peace, if you will, the post-World War II peace in the Far East. That President Trump wants to end this. Again, I think that, it's going to create a certain amount of fear, I think, on the part of the Chinese. It's going to lead to additional Chinese-Japanese tension. It's going to further destabilize the foreign policy situation generally in the Far East. Why the president wants to do this? He wants, look, he's an isolationist. I suppose that's in part, the explanation here. But I think there's a lot to be said for international stability. One of the most important, maybe the most important, single development since 1945 has been the fact that there has not been a third world war. We had a world war in 1914. 20 years after that ended, we had another world war beginning in 1937, 1939 in the Far East as well as in Europe, and it could easily have developed into the same kind of thing during the Cold War period. It did not, and one of the many reasons is that the existence of the treaty that you were referring to in respect to U.S. protection of Japan.
Yeah, from what I can tell on that, Trump does not like it. He says it's all one-sided, does nothing for the USA, but requires the USA to defend Japan, even though Japan doesn't do much for the U.S. I think that's how Trump looks at it. Dr. Ostrower, other news out of Asia, there's been a lot going on in Hong Kong, as you know, and as our listeners all know, and Japan has been pulling companies out of China. President Trump says there might be even more sanctions against China. Your thoughts where all this is leading as far as U.S. relations with Asia goes?
It's kind of weird. On one level, Trump seems to be in love with a number of Asian dictators. One of them is Kim Jong-un in North Korea, and Trump has literally said, he used these words, we love each other. And the other is with Xi in China. By the same token, while he seems to be cozying up to Xi as an individual, there is no question, I think, that American-Chinese relations are in a more fragile state right now than they have been in for the last 30 or 40 years, really since the Nixon administration. And I'm not sure where this is going to lead, but it can't lead to anything good. As the United States withdraws from NATO, as it withdraws from the World Health Organization, from the climate agreement, from the Japanese treaty, from some of the nuclear, some of the arms, the disarmament treaties, arms limitation treaties that have existed over the last 30, 40 years, really since the Reagan administration, we're finding that the Chinese are going to, and are already kind of filling that vacuum. As we retreat, the Chinese are advancing. In 1970, China was not a great power. In 2020, 50 years later, China is a great power, and we see the results of that. We see the signs of that literally all over the world. The Chinese are investing in railroads in Africa. They are investing in, they're buying ports, literally buying ports in countries like Sri Lanka and in Indonesia. It has already, I think, the effect of destabilizing things. I think that the Australians and New Zealand, certainly the Japanese, are plenty concerned about this kind of thing. The Vietnamese are plenty concerned because they have had a 1,000-year, very, very uneasy relationship with the Chinese to their, on their northern border. So, where all of this is going to end, I do not know. But I do know that the trade issues having to do with tariffs between the United States and China over the last 3 years since Trump became president has certainly worsened things, and Chinese efforts to expand some of their influence in the South Chinese Sea, including building islands from which they can establish air bases, is not helping things. I think that the Chinese have a lot of responsibility, but I think that American foreign policy has been confused. I think that American foreign policy is in many ways rather I don't know. I think I said this last week on this program. If you can tell me what American foreign policy is in the Far East, I'll give you a gold medal. We really don't have a foreign policy in the Far East, and it's been to the extent that we've attempted to do so, a foreign policy that has been undermined by some of the discontinuity, especially in the National Security Council. President Trump now has appointed 4 different people in 3 years to head up his National Security Council, and some of these people have been very, very much at odds with others. For instance, John Bolton essentially reversed, 180 degrees reversed, the policy of H.R. McMaster, General McMaster, when he was the head of the National Security Council. So, yeah, American foreign policy is confused, and confusion does not aid, it certainly doesn't aid the cause of international peace. I think we want stability rather than instability. We want certainty rather than uncertainty, and we're certainly not getting that from the administration.
Talking with Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, what do you think about this idea being talked up a lot lately? U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren for vice president on the Biden ticket.
Yeah, I don't know who it's going to be. I mean, on one level it could be, we're told that for the Democrats to win, they have to have a lot of black support. To get black support, you're going to have to appoint someone, or nominate someone who's African American. Certainly, I think Elizabeth Warren is more likely as a candidate than I would have thought 2 months ago. But honestly, I don't really know exactly what's going to happen. The fact that President Trump has not recently attacked Elizabeth Warren makes me think that, well, perhaps at least in the White House, they're not assuming it's going to be her. I was interested, and I think I had mentioned this to you in an email, that recently the president, this past Sunday, just a couple days ago, the president attacked in a very, very personal and really insulting way Stacey Abrams, who had run for governor of Georgia and lost. She is black, and the president attacked her because she's obese, as if somehow the president himself is not obese. Attacked Nancy Pelosi in very, very very personal terms and really very insulting terms. Attacked Joe Scarborough, who has a morning show on MSNBC. Attacks him because he claims Joe Scarborough is crazy, and that Joe Scarborough murdered a young woman who worked for him 20 years ago or so when Scarborough was a congressman from Florida. We've never seen, I know you've heard me say this before, we have never experienced this kind of thing in our entire presidential history. And if I can just turn for the moment to the issue of Scarborough allegedly murdering an aide. Her name was Clasudis, and her husband, who, again, this is almost 20 years ago, her husband wrote a letter to the president of Twitter, and this is just, within the last couple of days. And he says, I've mourned my wife every day since her passing. He says, I've tried to honor her memory and our marriage. As her husband, he said, I feel that one of my marital obligations is to protect her memory as I would have protected her in life. And then he goes on to say that there has been, and I'm reading from his letter, there has been a constant barrage of falsehoods, half-truths, innuendo, and conspiracy theories since the day that she died. And he goes on to say that the frequency, the intensity, the ugliness, the promulgation of these horrifying lies ever increases on the Internet. These conspiracy theorists, including most recently the President of the United States, to continue to spread their bile and their misinformation on your platform, in other words, the Twitter platform, disparaging the memory of my wife and our marriage. There's a woman by the name of an op-ed columnist for the New York Times. Doesn't write too often, but maybe, a couple times a month. Her name is Kara Swisher. Kara Swisher. And she has an op-ed in today's New York Times, which anyone can get by simply, going to nytimes.com. And it's worth reading. And, it points up the degree to which there is an ugliness. There is a kind of stain on the presidency today. And we see it most clearly, I think, in the way in which the president continues, and his son, Donald Jr., continues to argue that this young woman was murdered. She wasn't murdered. She had a heart condition, and she fainted as a result of the heart condition. She struck her head, and she died about 24 hours later in the hospital. The heart condition has to do with the thickening of the wall of the heart wall. It's unusual, but it's by no means unheard of. And yet, the president continues to do these conspiracy theories. His whole how shall I say it? His career, his political career, has been built on conspiracy theories. Obama, presumably was born in Kenya. Conspiracy theories about climate change. Conspiracy theories, for that matter, about the COVID-19 crisis, which he claimed was, based on a conspiracy hatched by the media, but it's all really a hoax. And other conspiracies as well, and then this becomes simply one more of his conspiracy theories. And these things have the effect of undermining. They have the effect of essentially, kind of corroding. It's like a cancer. They just corrode, I think, the vitality of American politics. There's a Republican, not a Democrat, a conservative Republican from Illinois. His name is Adam Kinzinger. And he said just yesterday, he tweeted, "Stop these conspiracy theories. Just stop spreading paranoia. It will destroy us." Now, if that was coming from Nancy Pelosi, one can say perhaps it's politics. But this is a conservative Republican, and I think that we have to take seriously what Trump is doing to the presidency and what he's doing to the country in terms of undermining our trust for each other. And this occurs during Memorial Day weekend.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower. I'm going to take a quick break, and we'll come back and talk about this day in history, and we'll include Memorial Day in that. Stay with us.
Cornell Partners for Growth would like everyone to know that we are thinking of you and hope everyone stays safe and healthy. We are working with our district businesses to get all necessary information out that is required to ensure a safe and healthy reopening for all employees and community consumers. To stay up to date on openings, community events, Steuben County, City of Hornell, and Hornell School District information, please like and follow us on Facebook at Hornell Partners for Growth. There you will find a list of businesses open with current hours updated weekly and posts shared from our businesses and local officials. Please stay safe, and remember, we appreciate your continued support to all local businesses.
Checking in now with meteorologist Rob Carolyn, who says heat and humidity are part of the plan for today.
That's right. Remarkable, considering where we were just a few short weeks ago, Brian. We were talking about cold and snow, and today I'm talking about temperatures close, dare I say, 90 degrees. Ooh, it's going to be a warm one out there, Brian. In fact, it's a mild morning across the southern tier. Lots of spots already in the 60s, and it's just going to go up all day long. We've got abundant sunshine across the state this morning. It's kind of cloudy down towards the city, but we're looking good across the western half of the state. All that sun leading to a high today of 85 to 90 degrees. If you're out and about, keep in mind that UV index today is going to be quite high, up around a 9. Tonight, we're partly cloudy. We're mild overnight, 60 to 65. The warm weather continues tomorrow. Lots of sun, a few fair weather clouds. 85 to 90 tomorrow afternoon. Tomorrow night we'll cloud up. We may see a shower, 60 to 65. Frontal boundary is going to work its way very slowly towards us on Thursday. That'll lead to clouds, a couple of showers, maybe a thunderstorm or around 80. There'll be more showers and thunderstorms Friday, and then cooler, drier weather will move in for the weekend. Sunrise earlier this morning, Brian, 5:38. The sun sets tonight at 8:36.
Back with Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. This day in history. Yesterday was Memorial Day. There's a very interesting video on the Hornell Facebook page. It's called "You Know You're from Hornell When," and it's a Facebook page. There was somebody posted a short home movie from 1926 taken in Hornell, and it's very clear, very good footage of what appeared to be World War I soldiers marching in the Memorial Day Parade in 1926 in Hornell. A lot of people on Facebook found this very interesting. Dr. Ostrower, in 2020, World War I is seen by many as very controversial. Some question it. U.S. involvement. Wondering, do you have a sense of what the feeling would have been in places like Hornell in 1926 about what would have been a recent war, then World War I? If you take yourself back to 1926 Hornell, New York, what do you think the feeling was among the soldiers and the local townspeople?
For the most part, we rally around the flag, and the war, remember, at that time had ended in 1918. 1926 is just 8 years later. There would have been a great deal of support, if not for the war per se, certainly for the people who fought in that war. I grew up in a little town in New Jersey called Woodbridge, and we would have, and I remember this from 1945, 1946 on, we would have a parade, which was essentially a Memorial Day parade, kind of focusing on World War I, not so much on World War II, although it soon became both World War I and World War II. Okay, a Memorial Day parade. And everyone in town showed up for that. The Boy Scouts were marching, the Girl Scouts were marching, the high school seniors were marching, the fire department was there, and no one asked, and I really mean no one asked, whether or not the marchers were Democrats or Republicans, whether they were liberals or conservatives. There was a sense of national unity that I think was very expressive of what you're describing in Hornell back in the 1920s, and I think it continued for quite some decades. I think that that's largely disappeared. There's a lot more partisan, and I think you've heard me before in respect to the degree to which I think that our current president is very, very divisive and is in some ways structuring his presidency on this kind of divisiveness. But that's more or less kind of recent. If you go back to the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, we certainly did not experience that kind of partisanship, and I think that for the most part there was a sense that World War I and World War II were very justified. World War II even more than World War I, because Hitler became the incarnation of evil. No one represented, evil, totalitarianism more than did Adolf Hitler. His racism, his aggressiveness, and so forth, I think, became legendary. And I think that was, again, one of the factors that kind of brought us together as a nation. Unfortunately, that was already, 75 years ago, and we have short memories. Historically speaking, we have short memories.
Dr. Gary Ostrower, do you have time for one more This Day in History?
Yeah, I wanted to say something about this day in history, and I also wanted to say something about Anita Hill. Maybe we can hold off on Anita Hill until next week. But I heard something on this program, on Newsmaker last week, which I think really deserves a response in defense of Anita Hill. But I want to say one thing about this day in history. People are not going to remember that, back in 1927, 93 years ago, the Model T Ford was discontinued. The Model T had been wildly popular. In 1910, I think, if I'm not mistaken, there were 20,000 Model Ts that were manufactured. By 1925, there were about 1,500,000 that were being manufactured each year. The American road system was in large measure a response, the paved roads to the Model T. But Henry Ford, in part because of competition, in part because of some technical advances, finally abandoned the Model T in 1927. He closed down all of his Ford plants for 6 months. All those folks who worked there were unemployed. They did not draw salaries, and then he replaced the Model T, which would be the Model A. And when the Model A first came on the market, on the very, very first day that it arrived, again, this would be in early 1928 or maybe the very, very end of 1927, about 400,000 people showed up at showrooms to see this Model A. But it never became as popular. It never became as iconic as the Model T. Henry Ford himself was a very controversial person and given to conspiracy theories, in some ways very similar, I think, to President Trump. And we can talk about that one of these days. 1927 was a fascinating year. It was the year that Sacco and Vanzetti were executed. It was the year of the Lindbergh flight over the Atlantic. It was the year that Babe Ruth hit 60 home runs. There were many, many elements of that year, and I'm only scratching the surface. That's worth talking about, and maybe we can have a program about 1927 one of these days.
Hey, that would be great. Just wrapping things up with Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. As always, Dr. Ostrower, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me here.